Hello, it's Joanne from St. Dunstan's back again um, to read more of Island of the Blue Dolphins. We'll pick up again with Chapter 6. After Kinky had been gone one moon, we began to watch for his return. Every day, someone went to the cliff to scan the sea. Even on stormy days we went, and on days when fog shrouded the island. During the day, there was always a watcher on the cliff, and each night as we sat around our fires we wondered if the next sun would bring him home. But the spring came and left, and the sea was empty. Kimki did not return. There were few storms that winter, and rain was light and ended early. This meant that we would need to be careful of water. In the old days, the springs sometimes ran low and no one worried, but now everything seemed to cause alarm. Many were afraid that we would die of thirst. "There are other things more important to ponder," said Natasep, who had taken Kimki's place. Natasep meant the Aleuts, for it was now the time of year when they had come before. Watchers on the cliffs began to look for the red sails, and a meeting was held to plan what to do if the Aleuts came. We lacked the men to keep them from landing or to save our lives if they attacked us, which we were certain they would. Plans were made to flee as soon as their ship was sighted. Food and water were stored in canoes, and these were hidden on the rocks at the south end of the island. The cliffs were steep there and very high, but we wove a stout rope of bull kelp and fastened it to rocks at the top of the cliff so that it hung to the water. As soon as the Aleut ship was sighted, we would all go to the cliff and let ourselves down one at a time. We would then leave in our canoes for the island of Santa Catalina. Excuse me. Although the entrance to Coral Cove was too narrow for a ship to pass through safely at night, men were sent there to watch the cove from dusk to dawn, besides those who watched during the day. Shortly afterwards, on a night of fine moon, one of the men came running back to the village. Everyone was asleep, but his cries quickly awakened us. "The Aleuts!" he shouted. "The Aleuts!" It was news we expected. We were prepared for it, yet there was much fear in the village of Galas-At. Natasep strode from hut to hut, telling everyone to be calm and not to lose time packing things that would not be needed. I took my skirt of yucca fiber, however, for I had spent many days making it, and it was very pretty, and also my otter cape. Quietly we filed out of the village along the trail that led towards the place where our canoes were hidden. The moon was growing pale, and there was a faint light in the east, but a strong wind began to blow. We had gone no farther than half a league when we were overtaken by the man who had given the warning. He spoke to Natasep, but we had all gathered around to listen to him. "I went back to the cove after I gave the alarm," he said. "When I got there I could see the ship clearly. It was beyond the rocks that guard the harbor. It is a smaller ship than the one which belonged to the Aleuts. The sails are white instead of red." "Could you see anyone?" Natasep asked. "No." "It is not the same ship that was here last spring?" "No." Natasep was silent, pondering the news. Then he told us to go on to where the canoes were and wait for him, for he was going back. It was light now, and we went quickly over the dunes to the edge of the cliff and stood there while the sun rose. The wind grew cold, but fearing that those on the ship would see the smoke, we did not set a fire, though we had meal to cook for breakfast. Instead, we ate a small quantity of dried abalone, and afterwards my brother Remo climbed over the cliff. No one had been down to the rocks since the canoes were hidden, so we did not know whether they were still safe or not. While he was gone, we saw a man running across the dunes. It was Nanko, carrying a message from Natasep. He was sweating in spite of the cold, and he stood trying to catch his breath. We all waited, urging him to talk, but his face was happy and we knew that he brought good news. "Speak," everyone said in a chorus. "I have been running for more than a league," he said. "I cannot talk." "You are talking," someone said. "Speak, Nanko, speak," cried many voices. Nanko was having fun with us. He threw out his chest and took a deep breath. He looked around at the circle of faces as if he did not understand why everyone was staring at him. "The ship," he said at last, saying the words slowly, "does not belong to our enemies, the Aleuts. There are white men on this ship, and they have come from that place where Kimki went when he left our island." "Has Kimki returned?" an old man broke in. "No, but it is he who saw the white men and told them to come here." "What do they look like?" Ulapi asked. "Are there boys on the ship?" asked Ramo, who had come back with his mouth full of something. Everyone seemed to be talking at once. Nanko made his face stern, which was hard for him to do, because his mouth had been cut in the battle with the Aleuts, and ever since it had always seemed to smile. He held up his hand for silence. "The ship has come for one reason," he said, "to take us away from Galas At." "To what place?" I asked. It was good news that the ship did not belong to the Aleuts. But where would the white men take us? "I do not know to what place," he said. "Kimki knows, and he has asked the white men to take us there." Saying no more, Nanko turned back and we followed him. We were fearful of where we were going, yet we were happy too. Chapter 7. We took nothing with us when we thought we would have to flee, so there was much excitement as we packed our baskets. Nanko strode up and down outside the houses, urging us to hurry. "The wind grows strong," he shouted. "The ship will leave you." I filled 2 baskets with the things I wished to take, 3 fine needles of whalebone, an awl for making holes, a good stone knife for scraping hides, 2 cooking pots, and a small box made from a shell with many earrings in it. Ulapi had 2 boxes of earrings, for she was vainer than I, and when she put them into her baskets, she drew a thin mark with blue clay across her nose and cheekbones. The mark meant she was unmarried. "The ship leaves," shouted Nanko. "If it goes," Ulapi shouted back, "it will come again after the storm." My sister was in love with Nanko, but she laughed at him. "Other men will come to the island," she said. "They will be far more handsome and brave than those who leave." "You are all women of such ugliness that they will be afraid and soon go away." The wind blew in fierce gusts as we left the village, stinging our faces with sand. Ramo hopped along far in front with one of our baskets, but before long he ran back to say that he had forgotten his fishing spear. Nanko was standing on the cliff motioning us to hurry, so I refused to let him go back for it. The ship was anchored outside the cove, and Nanko said that it could not come closer to the shore because of the high waves. They were beating against the rocks with the sound of thunder. The shore, as far as I could see, was rimmed with foam. 2 boats were pulled up on the beach. Beside them stood 4 white men. One of the men beckoned us to walk faster. He spoke to us in a language which we could not understand. The men of our tribe, except Nanko and Chief Matasep, were already on the ship. "My brother Ramo was there too," Nanko said. "He had run on ahead, after I had told him that he could not go back to the village for his spear." Nanko said that he had jumped into the first boat that left the cove. Matasep divided the women into 2 groups. Then the boats were pushed into the water, and while they bobbed about, we scrambled into them as best we could. The cove was partly sheltered from the wind, but as soon as we went through the passage between the rocks and into the sea, great waves struck us. There was much confusion. Spray flew. The white men shouted at each other. The boat pitched so wildly that in one breath you could see the ship, and in the next breath it had gone. Yet we came to it at last, and somehow were able to climb onto the deck. The ship was large, many times the size of our largest canoes. It had two tall masts, and between them stood a young man with blue eyes and a black beard. He was the chieftain of the white men, for he began to shout orders which they quickly obeyed. Sails rose on the tall masts, and two of the men began to pull on the rope that held the anchor. I called to my brother, knowing that he was very curious, and therefore would be in the way of the men who were working. The wind drowned my voice, and he did not answer. The deck was so crowded that it was hard to move, but I went from one end of it to the other, calling his name. Still there was no answer. No one had seen him. At last I found Nanko. I was overcome with fear. "Where is my brother?" I cried. He repeated what he had told me on the beach, but as he spoke, Ulapi, who stood beside him, pointed toward the island. I looked out across the deck and the sea. There, running along the cliff, the fishing spear held over his head, was Raymond. The sails had filled, and the ship was now moving slowly away. Everyone was looking toward the cliff, even the white men. I ran to one of them and pointed, but he shook his head and turned from me. The ship began to move faster. Against my will, I screamed. Chief Natasep grasped my arm. "We cannot wait for Ramo," he said. "If we do, the ship will be driven on the rocks." "We must," I shouted. "We must." "The ship will come back for him on another day," Natasep said. "He will be safe. There is food for him to eat, and water to drink, and places to sleep." "No!" I cried. Natasep's fast was like stone. He was not listening. I cried out once more, but my voice was lost in the howling wind. People gathered around me, saying again what Natasep had said, yet I was not comforted by their words. Ramo had disappeared from the cliff, and I knew that he was now running along the trail that led to the beach. The ship began to circle the kelp bed, and I thought surely it was going to return to the shore. I held my breath, waiting. Then slowly its direction changed. It pointed toward the east. At that moment, I walked across the deck, and though many hands tried to hold me back, flung myself into the sea. A wave passed over my head, and I went down and down until I thought I would never behold the day again. The ship was far away when I rose. Only the sails showed through the spray. I was still clutching the basket that held all my things, but it was very heavy, and I realized that I could not swim with it in my arms. Letting it sink, I started off toward the shore. I could barely see the two rocks that guarded the entrance to Coral Cove, but I was not fearful. Many times I had swum farther than this, although not in a storm. I kept thinking over and over as I swam how I would punish Ramo when I reached the shore. Yet when I felt the sand under my feet and saw him standing at the edge of the waves, holding his fishing spear and looking so forlorn, I forgot all those things I planned to do. Instead, I fell to my knees and put my arms around him. The ship had disappeared. "When will it come back?" Ramo asked. There were tears in his eyes. "Soon," I said. The only thing that made me angry was that my beautiful skirt of yucca fibers, which I had worked on so long and carefully, was ruined. Chapter 8. The wind blew strong as we climbed the trail, covering the mesa with sand that sifted around our legs and shut out the sky. Since it was not possible to find our way back, we took shelter among some rocks. We stayed there until night fell. Then the wind lessened and the moon came out, and by its light we reached the village. The huts looked like ghosts in the cold light. As we neared them, I heard a strange sound like that of running feet. I thought that it was a sound made by the wind, but as we came closer, I saw dozens of wild dogs scurrying around through the huts. They ran from us, snarling as they went. The pack must have slunk into the village soon after we left, for it had gorged itself upon the abalone we had not taken. It had gone everywhere searching out food, and Ramo and I had to look hard to find enough for our supper. While we ate beside a small fire, I could hear the dogs on the hill not far away, and through the night their howls came to me on the wind. But when the sun rose and I went out to the hut, the pack trotted off toward its lair, which was at the north side of the island in a large cave. That day we spent gathering food. The wind blew and the waves crashed against the shore so that we could not go out on the rocks. I gathered gull eggs on the cliff, and Ramo speared a string of small fish in one of the tide pools. He brought them home, proudly walking with the string over his back. He felt that in this way he had made up for the trouble he had caused. With the seeds I had gathered in a ravine, we had a plentiful meal, although I had to cook it on a flat rock. My bowls were at the bottom of the sea. The wild dogs came again that night. Drawn by the scent of fish, they sat on the hill, barking and growling at one another. I could see the light from the fire shining in their eyes. At dawn, they left. The ocean was calm on this day, and we were able to hunt abalone among the rocks. From seaweed, we wove a rough basket, which we filled before the sun was overhead. On the way home, carrying the abalone between us, Ramo and I stopped on the cliff. The air was clear, and we could look far out to sea in the direction of the ship had gone. "Will it come back today?" Ramo asked. "It may," I answered him, though I did not think so. "More likely it will come after many suns, for the country where it has gone is far off." Ramo looked up at me. His black eyes shone. "I do not care if the ship never comes," he said. "Why do you say this?" I asked him. Ramo thought, making a hole in the earth with the point of his spear. "Why?" I asked again. "Because I like it here with you," he said. "It is more fun than when the others were here. Tomorrow I'm going to where the canoes are hidden and bring one back to Coral Cove. We will use it to fish in and to go looking around the island. They are too heavy for you to put into the water." "You will see." Ramo threw out his chest. Around his neck was a string of sea elephant teeth which someone had left behind. It was much too large for him, and the teeth were broken, but they rattled as he thrust the spear down between us. "You forget I am the son of Chowig," he said. "I do not forget," I answered, "but you are a small son. Some day you will be tall and strong, and then you'll be able to handle a big canoe." "I am the son of Chowig," he said again, and as he spoke his eyes suddenly grew large. "I am his son, and since he is dead I have taken his place. I am now chief of Galas At. All my wishes must be obeyed. But first you must become a man. As is the custom, therefore I will have to whip you with a switch of nettles and then tie you to a red anthill." Ramo grew pale. He had seen the rights of manhood given in our tribe, and remembered them. Quickly I said, "Since there are no men to give the rights, perhaps you will not have to undergo the nettles and the ants, Chief Ramo." "I do not know if this name suits me," he said, smiling. He tossed his spear at a passing gull. "I will think of something better." I watched him stride off to get the spear, a little boy with thin arms and legs like sticks, wearing a big string of sea elephant teeth. Now that he had become chief of Galas At, I would have even more trouble with him, but I wanted to run after him and take him in my arms. "I thought of a name," he said when he came back. "What is it?" I asked solemnly. "I am Chief Taniso Sitlopai." "That is a very long name and hard to say." "You will soon learn," Chief Taniso Sitlopai said. I had no thought of letting Chief Taniso Sitlopai go alone to the place where the canoes were hidden. But the next morning, when I awoke, I found that Ramo was not in the hut. He was not outside either, and I knew then that he had gotten up in the dark and left by himself. I was frightened. I thought of all that might befall him. He had climbed down the kelp road once before, but he would have trouble pushing even the smallest of the canoes off the rocks. And if he did get one afloat without hurting himself, would he be able to paddle around the sand spit where the tides ran fast? Thinking of these dangers, I started off to overtake him. I had not gone far along the trail before I began to wonder if I should not let him go to the cliff by himself. There was no way of telling when the ship would come back for us. Until it did, we were alone upon the island. Ramo therefore would have to become a man sooner than if we were not alone, since I would need his help in many ways. Suddenly I turned around and took the trail toward Coral Cove. If Ramo could put the canoe in the water and get through the tides that raced around the sand spit, he would reach the harbor when the sun was tall in the sky. I would be waiting on the beach. For what was the fun of a voyage if no one was there to greet him? I put Ramo out of my mind as I searched the rocks for mussels. I thought of the food we would need to gather, and how best to protect it from the wild dogs when we were not in the village. I thought also of the ship. I tried to remember what Natasep had said to me. For the first time I began to wonder if the ship would ever return. I wondered about this as I pried some shells off the rocks, and I would stop and look fearfully at the empty sea that stretched away farther than my eyes could reach. The sun moved higher. There was no sign of Ramo. I began to feel uneasy. The basket was filled, and I carried it up to the mesa. From here I looked down on the harbor and farther on along the coast to the spit that thrust out like a fishhook into the ocean. I could see the small waves sliding up the sand, and beyond them a curving line of foam where the currents raced. I waited on the mesa until the sun was overhead. Then I hurried back to the village, hoping that Ramo might have come back while I was gone. The hut was empty. Quickly, I dug a hole for the shellfish, rolled a heavy stone over the opening to protect them from the wild dogs, and started off toward the south part of the island. 2 trails led there, one on each side of a long sand dune. Ramo was not on the trail I was traveling, and thinking that he might be coming back out of sight along the other one, I called to him as I ran. I heard no answer. But I did hear, far off, the barking of the dogs. The barking grew louder as I came closer to the cliff. It would die away, and after a short silence start up again. The sound came from the opposite side of the dunes, and leaving the trail, I climbed upward through the sand to its top. A short distance beyond the dune, near the cliff, I saw the pack of wild dogs. There were many of them, and they were moving around in a circle. In the middle of the circle was Ramo. He was lying on his back and had a deep wound at his throat. He lay very still. When I picked him up, I knew that he was dead. There were other wounds on his body from the teeth of the wild dogs. He had been dead a long time, and from his footsteps on the earth, I could see that he had never reached the cliff. Two dogs lay on the ground not far from him, and in the side of one of them was his broken spear. I carried Ramo back to the village, reaching it when the sun was far down. The dogs followed me all the way, but when I had laid him down in the hut and came out with a club in my hand, they trotted off to a low hill. A big gray dog with long curling hair and yellow eyes was their leader, and he went last. It was growing dark, but I followed them up the hill. Slowly they retreated in front of me, not making a sound. I followed them across 2 hills and a small valley to a 3rd hill whose face was a ledge of rock. At one edge of the ledge was a cave. One by one, the dogs went into it. The mouth of the cave was too wide and high to fill with rocks. I gathered brush and made a fire, thinking that I would push it back into the cave. Through the night I would feed it and push it farther and farther back, but there was not enough brush for this. When the moon rose, I left the cave and went off through the valley and over the 3 hills to my home. All night I sat there with the body of my brother and did not sleep. I vowed that someday I would go back and kill the wild dogs in the cave. I would kill all of them. I thought of how I would do it, but mostly I thought of Ramo, my brother. That's the end of chapter 8, and I'll be back soon with more of the Island of the Blue Dolphins. Thank you.